I've been getting involved in addressing homelessness in my town and recently sat in on a meeting about renovating a house into a women's shelter. And I was struck by how stupidly hard it is to help people get affordable or even emergency housing. It seems like all the wheels of regulation are jammed against any real progress. Hi, I'm Brandon, and I'd like to welcome you to the Crucible of Thought podcast. For the last few years, I've been rethinking a lot of my spiritual and political positions, and this podcast is where I explore the various topics and their impact on the church and the nation. This is episode number 147, and the title of this episode is, Why is it so hard to address homelessness? So, as I thought about the problems with bureaucratic roadblocks, it occurred to me, in this conservative town where I live, most people don't want the government to spend their taxes on the poor. Just like I was taught as a young conservative, they've been taught to blame the poor for creating their own problems. And as a result, they generally view welfare or anything that even smells like welfare as somehow enabling the poor to leech off of society. In his 1976 campaign, Ronald Reagan infamously popularized the derogatory image of the welfare queen, a black woman deliberately having child after child to amp up her welfare benefits and live off the largesse of the hardworking taxpayers. And unfortunately, that image actually worked really well, and it set the tone for a few generations of conservative voters. And beyond this, most well-off conservatives really don't want the unhoused living or sheltered near them. That would affect their property values, of course, and their own pocketbooks or wealth building are naturally more important to them than the welfare of their neighbors who have nothing of their own and live in a tent and push around their entire belongings in a shopping cart probably stolen from the nearby grocery store. And in my town, as in many others around America, those conservatives are solidly in the majority of the voting population. So, unsurprisingly, when they elect our county commissioners and vote on various spending and lawmaking, those conservatives do everything they can to entrench their dislike of welfare and low-cost housing in the legal system and the bureaucracy. And as a result, the local policies are set up to make it very hard, stupidly hard even, to do much to help the unhoused. And so, as I've been getting increasingly involved with the local unhoused population and sitting in on more and more meetings that try and do something about it, like a local homelessness prevention board or the shelter renovation meeting, I hear the participants talking about the obstacles that they face in their official roles in addressing homelessness. So, in the wake of those meetings, I spent a lot of time pondering about the topic and how we got here. Now, before I go any further, I should point out that I spent several decades as a staunch political and religious conservative. So, some of this analysis is based on thinking back to how I used to view the world and comparing it to my more recent and more compassionate understanding. I recognize that my sense of this problem may therefore be a little bit skewed by the political shift I've undergone, but I don't think it's skewed in a meaningful or a bad way, because I've been paying very close attention in the last few years as I've separated myself from that conservative thinking bit by bit, and I've begun to think carefully through the various policies and positions that I used to take. And also, by the way, I try to use unhoused instead of homeless, simply because I believe it better communicates something about the condition in which people find themselves and less about the attribute of the person. It's not their identity. I made this terminology decision after interviewing Kevin Nye, an author of a book on homelessness, and he persuaded me that unhoused is a better term for a lot of reasons. So I'll use homelessness as a noun, but generally I'll use unhoused when I need the adjective. And you can listen to that interview if you want. I'll put a link in the show notes. As I've been pondering homelessness, one particular thing that strikes me is how conservatives tend to think about the issues of welfare and other uses of tax dollars towards the unprivileged. I've discovered that politics is just as dogmatic as religion. Once a party takes a given position, its members willfully align themselves to that position, even if it clashes with something they once believed. Witness, for example, the sudden shift from the Clinton-era Republican mantra of character is everything to the Trump-era policies are everything, and we're going to overlook his character. So people will slavishly align themselves to a point of view without doing much critical thinking, just to keep themselves within their preferred tribe. One of the foundational motivations of conservatives is that they want to avoid spending money when it doesn't have a measurable effect. For a few decades now, since the New Deal era at least, if not a bit longer, the Republican Party has made a cornerstone of its platform a resistance to spending large amounts of government money on welfare programs or jobs programs or anything else of a similar nature. And part of that resistance is complaining that welfare is a never-ending, always growing money pit. And in fact, that there's a related assertion that when you spend money on welfare, it creates more need for welfare by creating a dependent class of people. I'm not going to bother with the truth of that assertion right now, other than to say that I fully believed it for decades, but I don't believe it any longer. So when the Republican Party, home to American conservatives, of course, declares that welfare is bad because it creates more welfare, conservatives will naturally align themselves to that political dogma, because in their mind, giving money to someone without getting anything in return is fundamentally a broken policy. It's very transactional. And here's the core of it. I think that conservatives are fundamentally unwilling to spend any money that they believe doesn't fix something. And they at least do recognize that we can't fix poverty in many cases, so they see it as a waste of money at best or harmful at worst, because they have grown to believe that welfare just creates more welfare dependency. So, in a town like mine, the deck is really stacked against anyone trying to actually help the poor people. And more than that, it's really stacked hard against the poor people, the unhoused, those with mental and health problems that prevent them from basic living wages and conditions. They end up being the ones who take the hit from these policies. Well, given that I used to be a devoted conservative Republican, I heard these anti-welfare talking points many, many times, probably a few times a week, as an avid Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity listener for years. And I even used those talking points many times myself. I really wish I could go back and have a conversation with younger me. I'd patiently show myself the data that proves so many of these ideas wrong. I'd show myself how the data I was using to justify these policies was really cherry-picked to make the case for shutting down nearly all public assistance programs. I'd ask younger me to think through the money trail. Where would those welfare savings actually go? The rich people they'd benefit at the cost of millions of lives destroyed. But I can't do that. So today, all I can think to do is to try and persuade people like younger me that I was wrong. But in this increasingly bifurcated world where people pick their own media echo chambers and hear literally nothing that doesn't agree with their existing conclusions, I really can't affect more than a few of my closest friends who might actually listen to me sharing data that confounds their conservative worldview. And I can go testify to the local politicians, perhaps, and share data that might get them possibly to reconsider some of the harmful policies. But what else can I do? The only thing I can see to do at this point, aside from changing just a few minds, is to try and navigate the stupid, hard system to do some good in this world. You see, Jesus said that the poor will always be with us. And from what I've seen, that's true. There is, and there always will be, a segment of population that just can't make it on their own, for a multitude of reasons that are simply not their fault. And so we have to decide whether we're going to follow Jesus' example and the instruction that is consistent throughout the entire Bible about how we treat the poor and the widows and the sick and the prisoner. And so no matter what tax money we spend on welfare or housing or shelters or food banks, the problem's not going to go away. So I want to focus for a few more minutes on the homelessness problem more so than welfare. When I started talking about this problem on social media, someone, unsurprisingly, replied that, well, these unhoused people just needed to get off their butts and get a job and get back to on their feet and stay there. Because in their mind, all unhoused people were unmotivated bums. Okay, in a perfect world with fully able humans and with no mental illness and no entrenched medical issues, maybe that would be a good point, but it's just not the way our world works. As I've spent some time over the last 3 years frequently interacting with the unhoused people in my county, both at a local homeless shelter and in a program that gives nightly shelter to people in the coldest winter months, I've discovered that there are really two categories of shelter. There's emergency and long-term. There are always some clients who are in the emergency, I lost my income and I have no housing until I get a new job group. It's an emergent crisis for them, and hopefully once they get a new job, they'll recover their stability and be back into stable housing. So we triage those people and try to sustain them through that gap. But there are also a lot more unhoused people of a different category than that emergency homeless group. These are the long-term shelter clients who have permanent debilitating issues which they simply cannot control and cannot fix, and which no amount of money or government assistance will remedy. Helping them get on their feet and stay there is flat out, unquestionably impossible. I know my former conservative tribe won't like that statement, but I assure you, in my experience, it's true. Most of these folks seem perfectly normal till you spend some time with them, and then you discover that they're deeply delusional or they have some other true mental health issues, and they'll never be able to get a solid job and hold it, much less one that pays a true living wage. It took me 2 lunch trips and a couple hours of discussion with, I'll call him Melvin, for example, to realize that while he presented as nearly perfectly normal, I mean, we had some neat conversations about the gospel and about his family, he had an internal thought life that bore very little resemblance to reality. But he hid it really well. And I didn't realize until after the second lunch that Melvin's stories really changed every time I talked to him. Like, first time I met with him for lunch, he told me about getting shot in the back of the head and surviving. Well, the next time I met, he had a story about someone who hit him in the back of the head with a hammer. I thought he was telling me 2 different stories, but then I realized later that I think he was telling me a different version of the same story in his mind. And each time, I think Melvin really truly believed that what he was telling me was the truth. But despite those crazy stories, I'm convinced there was not a bone of intentional deception in his body. So for someone like my friend Melvin, it's clear that nobody will hire him, and if they do, he'd not last a week. And I'm pretty sure that even high-priced medical care couldn't really fix his issues enough to stay employed. And he has nobody to care for him. His kids ghosted him years ago, he's solo, and he'll never get on his feet again, ever. Or consider, I'll call her Lucy. She's a delightful little old lady, very friendly to talk to, but not all there mentally any longer. She fell on hard times about a decade ago when she got ill, and she's permanently disabled now, in her late 70s. Her kids are dead. She's widowed. She can't drive, and she can't get around even without a walker. So with no money or property, she can't afford long-term care. She's far too old and crippled for a job that would pay enough for housing, so she has no chance of supporting herself. Melvin and Lucy and folks like them are the ones that well and truly are in the poor will always be with you category. And we can't write them off, can't disappear them, can't just export them. So I think the reality is that we simply have to budget some of our tax dollars on their behalf. And this is what I mean by the inadequacy of the conservative mindset just wanting to fix things. because there's no way to fix these people in any way that they won't need that long-term care. Years ago, such people were typically committed to asylums, where at least they got daily shelter and food. But it came at a horrible cost. The total loss of their liberty and the conditions in those asylums were often abhorrent. And so, over a few decades, compassion finally prevailed, and those asylums were shut down one by one. But the result, unfortunately, was the expulsion of all these people onto the streets, and there was absolutely nowhere for them to go. And my local housing office has a 7-year waiting list for housing, and they shut down new applications because they were so far behind. That's not going to be any help. Part of my conservative experience was the line that the government shouldn't be doing that work anyway. It should be the churches. And I heard and used that line for years. But now I look at the churches and I realize that's an absolute lie. For example, the average megachurch spends literally 99% of its money on everything other than caring for its community. With multi-million-dollar budgets, they spend around 1% of their donations to help anyone outside their own doors. I mean, if these churches with those budgets actually wanted to address homelessness, they could. But they don't, because the people attending those churches actually want the money to be spent on themselves in some fashion. Better paid staff, nicer building, better sound system, better lighting, maybe even a business jet for the globe-trotting star pastor. And those are all things that make their church experience more comfortable for them. And comfortable most certainly doesn't involve homeless or unhoused people coming into the building on Sunday mornings. Nope, that would be most unwelcome. A few times that happened at my former church. Elders were assigned to tail them around the building to keep an eye on them, basically made to feel them quite unwelcome. Make them a meal? Heavens no, that might encourage them to come back the next Sunday also, and we can't be attracting homeless people like that. And finally they were taken outside the front doors for a conversation. Something like, come back on Monday and talk to the folks in the office and see if they can help you. Pay no mind to their lack of transportation. Look, they're here now and so are we, but we want them to come back another day when only the staff has to see them? How heartless and uncompassionate that is. Okay, what about the assertion that people will just waste the money we spend on them? I mean, that's another common talking point. If we give money to unhoused people, we give them free food and housing, they'll spend that money on drugs or liquor. Well, what of that? What of it? So what? I've started paying attention to what Jesus said. If a man asks you for something, give it to him. Period. Full stop. No questions. Jesus did not say, well, first find out if he's worthy. I realized I'd been making that mistake my entire life. I wouldn't give $1 to a bum or go help at a soup kitchen because I couldn't be sure they really deserved the help. But I don't even ask now. If someone says they need money, at the very least, I'll walk to the nearest fast food joint with them and buy them a meal. No questions asked. Or I'll hand them a McDonald's gift card I keep in my car at all times now. And I don't worry that the people at the soup kitchen might not really need that meal. Sorry, their morality is between them and God. It's not for me to deal with. I'm just here to bless them and treat them like Jesus did. I don't think there are any examples in the gospel where Jesus asked whether they needed it. He just gave, healed, blessed. And I don't like the common retort, but Jesus knew their hearts and didn't do it unless they needed it. I reply, show me one single example where he really turned someone away. Even after telling the Canaanite woman that his ministry was to the Jews and not to the dogs, he still met her needs. And so I've got to follow his example, not my rationalizations. The writers of the Gospels chose how to portray Jesus, and if they'd seen examples where he turned away undeserving people, they didn't choose to share those stories with us. So we've got to take Jesus at his example as it's recorded in the Gospels. When someone asked him for something, it was given. Period. Okay, you say, but they're still all substance abusers. Well, here's my problem with that assertion. It's completely wrong. I know and serve real unhoused people. many of them are totally sober and not substance abusers. Only about a third of them are temporarily unhoused because of lost jobs or medical debt or something like that. And of the other 2/3, many are unhoused because of serious mental illness, not coupled with substance abuse. In other words, I believe this all abusers picture of the problem is highly incorrect. Okay, so you say, but homeless people frequently refuse shelter. And some places have written laws to arrest homeless people who repeatedly refuse the offer of shelter. Surely that's good, right? Well, no, actually not. There's actually a lot of good reasons why people refuse offer of shelters. And I'll link an article in the show notes that points out why that might be. Sometimes it's because they just, like anyone, don't like to be coerced. Sometimes they don't want to sit through another sermon just to get a place to sleep. And sometimes they just don't really want to be with other homeless people because that's not how they see themselves. Now, the ratio of drug users does depend on the area, with certain places experiencing much higher drug problems than others. And the unhoused druggies tend to accumulate in those areas. But the clean and sober homeless people, the unhoused people, just don't want to be around them, which is why they often refuse housing. And note that these high homelessness, high drug areas are where most of the news about homelessness originates. So you're seeing a very, very lopsided picture if you're not personally working with the unhoused. So I gently suggest to anyone who insists on the universality of drug and alcohol abuse problems and the refusal of help that they might actually benefit from going and serving at a local homeless shelter or helping to conduct the homelessness counts that most locales do periodically. Go meet the people. Take a couple of them out to lunch or dinner and spend time actually talking with them. And more importantly, actually listening to them without judging. Find out what they're missing in their assessment of the problem. And by the way, there's a big difference between a soup kitchen and a homeless shelter. I serve at both. A soup kitchen serves mostly housed people. And in any case, there's a huge difference between just filling someone's plate and actually sitting down and getting to know them, to take time after serving them to love them personally. Because it's too easy to look at them with disdain or disgust, even while serving them, and then walk away without learning a single thing about them or their stories. I'm personally convinced after a few years of being involved in this ministry that simply having close contact with unhoused people will completely change anyone's mind about their character, their nature, their situations, their true needs. So, in short, to wrap this up, all the accusations and assertions by most conservatives about the homelessness problem and its solutions are utterly misinformed and actually dangerous. In fact, I think it's arguable from the data that I've seen that these conservative policies actually make things worse, not better. The truth is that it's actually far cheaper for the government to simply house unhoused people than to pay for all the costs of dealing with them in their unhoused condition, including increased medical costs, crime and incarceration, etc. Numerous studies and numerous examples from cities all around the nation and the world consistently show that fewer tax dollars are spent when we just swallow our desire to fix people and instead simply house them. And this is partly because of a very simple and easily understood, but usually ignored fact. When someone is unhoused, it dramatically damages their emotional and physical health. And in those conditions, quite a few people become susceptible to addictive and self-destructive behaviors. In other words, being unhoused creates a spiral for many people. It leads them into worse conditions, which makes it even less likely that they can get back into a stable job and housing again, which makes their emotional and physical health worse, and on and on and on. On the other hand, simply getting people housed eliminates most of those pressures and increases the chances that they will successfully get off and stay off the streets and back to supporting themselves. So look, if we really want to be conservative with our tax dollars, ignoring homelessness is not the right answer. And neither is telling an unhoused person to suck it up and get a job, because as we've discussed, most of them simply can't. Unless we simply provide quality, reliable housing, they're going to be a significant burden on the budget for life. And so housing isn't cheap, but it's cheaper than what conservative districts like my town are actually doing. So we need to find a way to break through these stupid hard barriers against homeless ministries, helping homeless people, unhoused people. We need more low-cost housing. We need to break the NIMBY, the not in my backyard barrier, and get that housing in areas where services are available, not hiding them off in the far corners of the county. And we need to motivate people to participate in homeless shelter ministry so that they can learn the reality about the problem and about the wonderful people made in God's image that are being served. I'll close with this simple observation. If you add up all the tax breaks that people like me that are well off that we get, like a home mortgage deduction, energy efficiency appliance rebates, lower zero-emission vehicle rebates, education credits, health insurance tax credits, the average middle to upper class person gets plenty of free handouts from the government. It's just not called welfare. But we sure feel entitled about that all, don't we? So maybe we can have a little more grace towards those who truly desperately need it and be willing to spend a bit more of our tax dollars to dramatically change the world for them. As the story goes about the boy walking along the beach, picking up and throwing beach starfish back into the water, we might not be able to save every starfish, but we can save some of them. And for those that we can save, it means everything. So let's be like that. Thanks for spending some time with me today, and we'll talk again soon.